I'm going to tell you, I saw a post online as I was starting to write something the other day. I don't know if you've ever done that. You're writing something, all of a sudden something pops up over here and you see it. And I just thought, I just gave it a quick response, to a friend and said, I don't believe that. And it was about some internet celebrity or something like that. They were saying something, and I don't know, I don't know them, but they were saying something outlandish. So I was just offhand comment. And it was funny, to which that responded to someone commenting to me and someone commenting back, and then we conversation. And then 20 minutes later, there's 20 minutes of my life that's gone. Over just, I don't believe that. It really was that. And everything's cool. The guy's great. But it's amazing to me how I had this purpose of writing this thing, and I saw that, and one comment, and then boom, 20 minutes are gone. It just seemed like they evaporate. 1 second of diverting from the mission and the purpose I was on, and there you go. Time just flits away. The truth is that knowing your purpose is essential for your success in life, and running everything you do through that purpose is important. If it's really your purpose, then nothing really can escape being connected to that purpose. And if it could be not connected to your purpose, it would be detracting from the resources that you have to reach your mission, to reach your goal, because it could be a diversion of focus or a resource from the pursuit and the planning and the purpose that you were going for to something else. One of the most dangerous things in an organization is called missional drift. Does anybody know what that means, missional drift? It's when you have a mission to do something and your organization over time, this is a good idea. We'll just kind of do that. And then that becomes more important. And then we see some success there. We're going to kind of do that. And we'll do more like that. And we got something else that branches off of that. And before you know it, this and this and this and this and this are all doing these things. And then you see where my hands went farther and far away from the mission. And that's easy to be done. You can drift away from that mission, but it can also happen on the individual level, just like it did with me in that one offhand comment and 20 minutes are gone. So when it does, because it will, the distractions of life get in our way. What do you do? When it happens, when it does, how do you get back? And what's the damage that it does? Well, this morning we're going to take a look at what I think is Paul's purpose statement, or at least one of the most clear statements he made in one of his writings of what his purpose is. And I think that, he talks about it in several places, but this one is extremely clear. And today we're going to continue our study through the book of Philippians. We're going to be jumping into Philippians chapter 3, verse 10. So the good thing is when you get to verse 10, you can stay right there, because we're going to stay there for a little while. And here's the Philippians 3:10. I want to know Christ and experience the mighty power that raised him from the dead. I want to suffer with him, sharing in his death. Now, we're going to stop right there. If you would like to follow along with notes, Jill does a great job with that. You can go to baywestchurch.com/notes. I think YouVersion's having a little bit of a problem right now, so I would suggest if you're going to follow them, go that way to it on your smart device. But this statement, whether you realize it or you pass by it, is really Paul's purpose statement. So years ago, I was introduced to a discipleship system called One-on-One with God. It was a book that was written by Jerry and Marilyn Fine. And Jerry and Marilyn Fine were Sunday school teachers for a young adult, young married class back in the early 70s. And they taught it a lot, and they follow Christ, and they've devoted their lives to Christ. And what they began doing out of that class is Jerry would meet with the guys, like one-on-one, like one guy at a time, and Marilyn would meet with the girls, or the ladies, one at a time, and they would spend a period of weeks with them and help them understand what it's like to follow Christ. What are the habits you need to do? How does this work? How do you make decisions? How do you go about how do you order your day? What are some good habits and things for that? And they started doing this, and it became very popular. And they began you started to see mature disciples come from that. And so more and more people wanted to meet with them. And I remember hearing Jerry say one time, I would meet with someone at 5 to 7, and then 7 to 9, and then I would go to work, and then I would meet with someone from like 7 to 9 when I got home that night. It was crazy. And it got to the point where Jerry's job, which was he had a company that built runways for airlines. that job got in the way of his purpose. And so he said, you know what, I can't do this job anymore. So he sold his company, retired early, and devoted the rest of his life to making disciples one-on-one. And they wrote this curriculum, which was just what they were doing. They wrote it down in a book called One-on-One with God. And eventually, you know, in my estimation, honestly, if you look at numbers, they're probably over the last 40-something years, I believe they've been doing this, 40 to 50, getting close. It's really getting close. They've touched the lives of hundreds of thousands of people and made hundreds of thousands disciples through that. It's being used in 50 different countries. It's been translated into 18 different languages. In fact, this week, and right now, my sister-in-law, Katie's sister, and her husband, Jerry and Marilyn, are Don's parents. So I have Daphne, Katie, sister Daphne, husband Don, Jerry and Marilyn are his parents. And they're actually in Africa on a mission trip touring what God is doing through One-on-One with God for this past week. They're ending it up and going to be back like Monday. But it's amazing to hear all the stories that are going on. We actually had Jerry and Marilyn in here years ago to do a weekend and to talk about that. And we've used One-on-One with God. Some of you have gone through that, in your journey. But in the book, they use this verse as a very central key point of the discipleship curriculum. And I've told you, we've used the Amplified version. I use that a lot. The Amplified Bible, is the translation that takes the Greek word and gives you every single word that Greek word might mean, and we use it. Well, they ask you to memorize that verse in the Amplified Bible. So here it is, right here. We should have that. And so you can see that's hefty, right? So I'm going to just read through that. Here is Philippians 3:10. This is every Greek word that is translated in English. That gives you just about every possible angle that you can know that word might mean, to give you every connotation that's possible. You can see this is hard. This is be difficult to memorize. But it goes, for my determined purpose is that I may know him, that I may progressively become more deeply and intimately acquainted with him, perceiving and recognizing and understanding the wonders of his person more strongly and more clearly. And that I may in that same way come to know the power outflowing from his resurrection, which it exerts over believers. And that I may so share his sufferings as to be continually transformed in spirit into his likeness, even to his death in the hope. Now, what I want to do is actually take this verse, and I'm going to go phrase by phrase through this and teach you some of the things that are buried in our translations, that to try to give a fuller understanding of what Paul is really saying here. And so the first thing I want to look at is where it started, determined purpose. I want to center on that for just a second. Paul is saying that his purpose is to know Christ. He's saying so much more, though, because he uses this word that is better translated, my determined purpose. And there's a lot of meaning in that. What it means is that it's planned. This is intentional. It's been said that if you want to figure out what your purpose is, why don't you just add up all your life's actions, and the sum of that will be what your purpose actually is. You may say, I have this purpose. But then you look at your schedule and you look at what you do and how you do things and the reason you make decisions and the words that you say and the things that you think and the stuff that you use to fill your time. And you might go, you know what? Those things are in conflict. That can sometimes happen. You can truly mean, I'm going to make my purpose is about knowing Christ, for example. And you can have things in your schedule that pull you every other way, that are competing with your ability to know Christ more deeply. And that can happen. That's a form of missional drift. But also there's sometimes things called missional apathy, where people, I just live my life. I'm just going to do the things that are before me. I'm going to make my decisions at random on what I do. And then what I end up with, that's what I have. And what I end up with, ultimately at the end, was my life's purpose. When you think about it. All the things that I just happened to be there. But Paul was not that way. Paul's was specific. It was planned. It was determined. And our purpose should not be something that we just stumble around into that's being made up as we go. It can seem that way when we follow Christ, because Christ doesn't give us everything that's going to happen. And he doesn't tell you every reason that every situation is in your life and all he's going to teach you from that. He just does it. But this is a given, it's a planned activity. In Psalm 139, David was very clear. He writes this about the Lord. He said, you saw me before I was born. Every day of my life was recorded in your book. Every moment was laid out before a single day had passed. See, but it's not just planned. This is also given. Psalm 103, David writes, acknowledge that the Lord is God. He made us. We are His. We are His people and the sheep of His pasture. And I want you to think about that. Our purpose is assigned to us, but let's think through it a little bit more. Think about that term, His pasture. I grew up on a farm, and I understood what that was. We'd have these large fields, and we would build fences around those fields, and cows, usually for us, because that's what we had, would reside in the field, and they would eat the grass, or we would drop hay off for them, and we'd have water sources for them, and different things like that. But the shape of that field was determined by us. We put that down. The grade of it often was determined by us. Where we chose to put them was determined by us. That was our pasture that we put them in. See, God thought you up. God designed you and me, and He chose each and every person here to exist, and He did that for a reason, and our purpose was part of that existence. You are never in a place that God doesn't have a valuable purpose for you. I want you to remember that. You're never in a place that God doesn't have a valuable purpose for you. And that purpose is a gift crafted by God. And what is that purpose when you think about it? It's not a worldly metric. Paul was very clear. He said, look, that's so, Paul said it's that I may know Him. That's my determined purpose, that I may know Him. You might think Paul's purpose was church planting. No, it was not. It was that I might know Him. You might think, Paul's purpose was being irritating to the Pharisees and arguing with a lot of people. Yeah, they did all that stuff. That's not his purpose. His purpose was that he may know Christ. So the purpose that Paul saw at the foundation of what he was not, I'm going to plant churches and write the Bible, but so how could he know all of those things? He just had to know Christ. At the core, it was simply, I need to know Christ. And Paul talked about this. He talked about the famous speech that he gave at the Areopagus. This is listed in Acts 17. In verse 26, it says this. It says, for one man created all the nations throughout the whole earth. He decided beforehand when they should rise and fall, and He determined their boundaries. He's given a speech here with some Greek philosophers. They're kind of debating about it. So he sets this up. One man created all the nations throughout the whole earth. He decided beforehand that they should rise and fall. He determined their boundaries. In verse 27, he says this. It says, His purpose was for the nations to seek after God and perhaps feel their way toward Him and find Him, though He's not far from any of us. All this, everything you see is the pasture of God, and He created it that way for a specific reason, so that we might seek after Him. That was His purpose. It wasn't just to find out that He exists. It's so much more. And this is what Paul said that it looked like in Philippians 3:10. We're going to jump back to that. And so we'll pick up partway through the verse. He said, so that I may know Him, that I may progressively become more deeply and intimately acquainted with Him, perceiving and recognizing and understanding the wonders of His person more strongly and more clearly. Now that is a mouthful. I hated having to memorize that. And I probably couldn't do it now because my memory is not what it was. But this wasn't just to happen, but I want you to understand, looking at that verbiage, you can see this was not just to happen all at once. We're saved immediately, yes. But knowing and all of this process of knowing God happens over time. It's meant to take time. It's meant to be a day in, day out relationship where bonds are built over time and tested, and God is revealed more and more each day. When you try to lose weight, I don't know if you've tried like a magic bullet for losing weight or something like that, and you've lost a pile of pounds. Maybe you've just been so successful and you've lost like 30, 40 pounds and you just did it super quick, and then all of a sudden you're like, okay, I'm good. I can go back to eating like I was, and I can stop working out, and all of a sudden you're right back where you were. You ever done that? That's because losing weight in a flash like that often doesn't take. What happens is when you lose it slowly, you're changing your lifestyle, and what you're doing is you're changing how you do things, and it becomes more set in who you are, and it comes along and stays off. They say it takes 13 weeks to create a habit in your life. In other words, you can do it purposefully once. Everybody can do that. You can say no to the dessert or whatever, however it is. I'm going to go work out here, or I'm going to save this money, or whatever you do. You can do it once. But over time, if you continue to do it, it takes root in your life and it becomes a part of you. And God created us that way because he wanted us to know that slow change is valuable. You aren't accomplishing a quick task in knowing God. He is literally morphing you into something new. Yes, you become a new creation, but he's continually creating who you are. And you're finding that out, and you're seeing that. Our knowing of him is meant to grow over time. It's meant to become more deep, more intimate. What I know of Christ now is vastly different than what I knew of Christ at 12 and 16 and 24. At 24, I thought I knew everything. I didn't know jack. I'm going along, and I'm learning more and more about Christ. It's like, God, I'll learn what's in the room, and God will open a door and go, hey, check that out. And it's like, oh my, what? You got to be kidding me. I thought I had it, but I didn't see that door over there behind that thing that you just opened up, but he does. It's deep, and our relationship is meant to be deep and personal. It's not theoretical, but it's a relationship that is lived out and not one that is just talked about. That's what our relationship is meant to be. Our relationship is meant to be lived through our job and our work and our family and our friends. All the things that we do, going through all of that is part of us getting to know God. That's part of it. It comes down to progression and stages and not everything at once. Often it's pieces and bits, and they don't come immediately right after it. Some of it is here, some of it is there. You may go a long stretch and then it all comes at once. Loads of things like that happen. But I want to look at three aspects of this knowing from the AMP here, and I want to show you what I'm talking about with this. First, there's perceiving. The first thing you begin to do when you begin to follow Christ is as you start your relationship with Christ, is you begin to know that he is there. Okay? You're starting to recognize. When I begin to follow Jesus, I'm like, all right, we're doing this. And I charge out. I was 8. What did I know? I'm like, what am I supposed to do, God? You're here, we're doing stuff, and God's like, slow down, Holmes. It's going to take a while. We're going to work on this. You got a long way to go. I couldn't conceive being almost 58, like a half century of following Jesus, but I couldn't conceive that. But I wanted to know, but I begin to know that he's there. Perceive means you become aware or conscious of. You know that there's something greater at play than what I just see. When you came to know Jesus, probably even before that, you may have thought there's something bigger than just me. And then you found Christ and you begin to follow him. But it's not just perceiving, you're also recognizing. The second thing you start to see is God working in the world. It's one thing when you know something's out there, but it's another thing to begin to recognize it. When you're playing a video game and you know the patterns and stuff like that, and then they're there, and then all of a sudden one day it clicks on, oh, I know that pattern. I know how to defeat that pattern because you're going to do this, and then you're going to do this, then you're going to do this, then I'm going to do that, and it's going to be over. I win. I heard Priscilla Shirer, she gave an illustration recently. I'm not going to try to repeat it because she's amazing. But the point of it was the reason that we spend time with God is as we spend time with him, much like we would spend time with a friend, we begin to know them and recognize them. You may have a friend that you've spent a lot of time with, and if they got a special way they walk, and if they walked in that door and lights were in your face and all you could see was like the silhouette of them, you'd know exactly who it was. That's so-and-so. There they are. Or they call you on the phone, and immediately when they say the first word, you're like, I know who that is. Yeah, I know them. Or you're in a room and you hear them talking, and you're like, oh, that's them. I know that's right. And you understand that. The same is true with God. Something starts to happen around us where we start to see something happening, like, whoa, wait a minute. I recognize this. God's doing something. Seen this before, read about it in the Word, seen something like that, and you realize it's God. Because, what said John 10:27? It said, you are his sheep, and you know his voice, and you follow him. In other words, I see what you're doing, and you draw my attention to you, God, because I just saw that. I've seen that before. I come to that. I see that. And you do this. And in Romans 1, Paul talks about how this recognition helps us learn about God. He says, for since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature has been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made. So in all the things around you, God has stored all these Easter eggs into everything that you do, and every process is showing how you are and what you do. And what it's doing is when you go through all of those tasks for you, it shows who God is and what God's doing. And when he does something, you're like, hey, I recognize that. I know your voice. In other words, I know your patterns. I know how you are. I see you coming this way. I'm going to pay attention to that because I see it. And I'm going that way. But then doesn't stop there. It goes even further. But you begin to understand who Jesus is even more. See, the app translates it here as the understanding the wonders of his person more strongly and more clearly. In other words, after I see all these patterns, I see God do stuff, and I go, oh, I understand that. Oh, I see how you're doing that. And as you start to see more things, as it opens up more things, you're like, oh, I see that happen because you did that. So that's how you do it. You do a little bit of that there. Okay, I know it's not all of it, but that's my little part, and I see that. And that becomes integrated into how I follow Christ and how you follow Christ. I see that part. Okay, I want to see that again. When I see it again, I see it happen, and I thank God for it, and all of these things, and you begin to understand it. You begin to understand what he's doing, how he works, not in full, but more and more. And you see it more strongly and more clearly. And back in Philippians 3:10, we'll pick up there. It says, and that I may in that same way come to know the power outflowing from his resurrection, which exerts over believers. See, in that same way, that experiential, deep, growing relationship happening in real time as you walk through life in every second, I would know that power outflowing from his resurrection in my life. And that is what's happening in me as a Christ follower. A lot of times, one of the things that's really undersold about following Jesus is that we have the power that raised Christ from the dead, that awesome, amazing thing, that event that happened that everybody goes back to and points to when they talk about the gospel, the things that drove the Romans nuts. I can't believe this. Oh, really? We're going to have to admit this happened. We're not going to admit this happened. We're going to try to cover it up. Oh, my goodness. All this stuff that keeps coming back, that changed our trajectory for eternity. This thing, the power that caused that, runs through us. That's running through your body and your spirit right now. Absolutely. And you and I have that same power that raised Christ from the dead available at work inside of us. And so when you say, I can't live the Christian life, whatever, that's the dumbest thing to ever say. That's ridiculous. It's ludicrous. It's ignorant because it's never just you. You have the power that raised Christ from the dead. Oh, that can't make you do the right thing in this situation or teach you something or walk through this situation or forgive your numbskull nonsense or whatever like that. That can't do it. Oh, come on. I mean, let's stop selling God short. Now, I may not just walk around and go to dead people and go, you're alive, and they just raise up. That's not kind of really how it works. But what God does in our lives there is a correlation with raising something from the dead with the power that God puts in our lives and what he does for us. And it's hard to understand sometimes. I mean, I get it. There are emotional moments sometimes when we are following Jesus, right? And something really big happens and like, oh, I totally get this life thing. And it's that moment. It's like, wow, I'm alive. I see what you're talking about, God. We've had these moments. But sometimes it's it's a cumulative effect over time, but what does it mean to experience it? Romans 8:11, Paul wrote this. He said, the Spirit of God who raised Jesus from the dead lives in you. And just as God raised Christ Jesus from the dead, he will give life to your mortal bodies by this same Spirit living within you. So the power that raised Christ from the dead is working in you, in your mortal body right now, where we are. And it's working in you and me, and it's renewing us, it's healing us, it's bringing us back from the dead spiritually in great ways. But I want you to know a few things that this shares with us, things that are really important that this verse teaches us. The first thing is it teaches us the level of sacrifice that Jesus gave for us. It took Christ's sacrifice to meet justice for my life. If it was just me, it took that to pay the price for my sin. Okay? There was nothing else. Nothing less would do. There is nothing more valuable than Christ's sacrifice. 1 John 2:2 tells us that Jesus himself is a sacrifice for not only our sins, but everyone's. There's nothing else that could do that. Acts 4:12 tells us that salvation is found in no one else. This is it. There was no other way to do this without Jesus dying on a cross and sacrificing his life. But just as it took the death of Jesus to pay for our sin, here's the thing. It helps us to understand the level of power that God exercises on us. That should make you comforted. It should make you confident in the power that God is putting. It takes that level of power that raised Jesus from the dead to transform us. We'll talk a little bit more about it next week in the full scope of what that means. But what this does is it tells us that there is no other answer here. In 2 Corinthians 12:8, Paul writes, and God is able to make all grace abound to you, so that having all sufficiency in everything, you may have an abundance for every good deed. There is never a time. See, a lot of times we think sometimes, I'm doing pretty good. So God needs a lot of grace for the dude that's messing up over there. He needs more grace for Hector because Hector's really messing up. I'm doing better than Hector, so I don't need as much grace as Hector needs right now. This is not true. There's never a time. I can't be good enough to not need all the grace of God at every moment. Neither can you. We need the full measure of God's grace at every moment for God to forgive us. And God says, look, I'm giving it all in that. That's massive. But when you realize the massive sacrifice and the massive power, the level of power that God is exercising to make us right with him, you realize you have to conversely realize the level of damage sin does to us. If it takes that much power to save us, and it takes that level of unique sacrifice, it shows us how bad the problem really, really is. At the bottom of most apologetic conversations that I have with people, and I have quite a few, it comes back down to, at some point, that's rooted in sin, man. And it's really that bad. All the questions you have about the world come back to that. I know you don't think it's connected, but it absolutely is. And that is flowered into this over generations. Whatever, point at this, or point at that, point at this, point at that, whatever you want to say, it comes back to this. The problem is really that bad. It has spawned so much pain and division and hurt in our world. And it takes the level of sacrifice that Jesus gave. It takes the level of power that God exercises. And because it is that bad, part of God's grace, honestly, I've shared this with you, may be allowing us to not fully comprehend the level of damage that we're doing when we follow sin. Because if we fully realized it, if we really understood it, I believe it would overwhelm us. And I've said a couple weeks ago, part of the agony in hell, I believe, will be the realization of how bad the problem truly is. And what you have chosen, realizing I chose to put myself here. I chose it. I had a choice. I've chosen for myself the truth that now, while you spent an entire life an inch from a solution, you chose the punishment, and you only have yourself to blame. And we see people go mad over regrets here that are astronomically smaller, infinitesimally smaller than what that regret will be. And here we can watch Netflix and forget about it for a minute. There will be no forgetting about it in hell. There's no distraction from it. There will be no distraction, no relief, no taking your mind off of it for the entirety of eternity. That's what's going to make that so bad. But what Paul says too is in verse 10, he says, so that I may share his sufferings. Now that's weird, man. I'm sorry. I think a lot of the time, and you may feel this way too, when I was growing up, Christ suffered, so I didn't have to. Why do I need to share in that? What would prompt God why would God prompt Paul to write that? And one reason is to let us know that God can work through the hard things that are coming in our lives. It's to give us some hope. The truth is that even in our hardships, God's still working. He's transforming us to be more and more like Jesus. We're getting better through the bad things that happen to us. Believe it or not, it happens. You know, I've been trying to get on the elliptical and do 30 minutes. My knees are not happy with me, even though that's a good thing for your knees. My joints are not happy with me sometimes. You know, my thighs, they just like rebel, and I do this, and it's like I do this, and it really hurts. I just bend my leg, and it really hurts. You know, but the truth is, I'm getting healthier through that process. You know, it's hilarious. I mean, we know this with any kind of exercise you do. It's hard sometimes, and you don't want to do it, and you want to quit, but you put yourself through it anyway because benefit comes through a level of suffering. Sometimes better health comes through a level of suffering. And we get this. That's why we have operations to get better. That's why we take nasty tasting medicine to get better. You know, we have to spend money to make money. I mean, you know, the concept of taking one step back to move two steps forward, we get that. I think God made us that way and made the world that way to introduce the concept of suffering being something that can bring positive results. And I think he did that to explain to us what we're going through here. We often spend our time trying to avoid suffering, but God has shown us throughout the Bible that he accomplishes things through suffering. He does. Often we think that suffering can't be a part of our purpose, you know, but if it was a part of Jesus's and good came from it, I think we should want to share in that. God made it so that even Christ's sufferings help to transform us to be more like him. Through his stripes, we are healed. You see that? It's not just Christ's sufferings, but it's also the sufferings that we share in as we follow Christ. And they will come. Jesus told us that. He was upfront about it, which is amazing that people still followed him because he's like, yeah, it's not going to get bad. It's going to get rough. They're going to hate you. It's okay. And you get out there and they find out, yeah, people do hate us. And we're still following you anyway. It's going to get better. No, it's not. They're still going to be mad. It's all right. We'll work it out. I've overcome the world. You just got to work through it. That's what I will work through you as you work through it. God is using those things to make us better, though, and to make us more full believers in Christ. See, God is working through those things to help us know Christ more and to make us more into the picture of Christ, even through his death. And as it says in verse 11, that I may experience the resurrection from this dead existence that I live, that we'll look at next week. A new life that is real life, that Jesus has made possible for us through what he did on the cross. But back in verse 10, we'll pick up there. It says, to be continually transformed in spirit into his likeness, even to his death in the hope. Now, what we know that through all these things, we are being transformed. We're being transformed. We're growing. And honestly, in some sense, our suffering is growing pains as we experience our growth to be more like Christ. You know, because that is the result that we're shooting for. Christ is not just our example, but our aspiration. You know, does that mean that we'll look like him? No, it's like we're going to be transformed in spirit. I'm not going to grow a beard or whatever. I don't even know what Jesus looked like. How am I going to dress like Jesus? You know, I got a lot of pictures of him, but do we really know exactly? That'd be hard, you know. Beauty mark? No, I don't know. You know, I mean, how would I do that? But we're being transformed in spirit in his likeness even. That's what we're doing. So what does it mean to look like him? It means that we are a picture of him in our lives, and we're growing more and more like him in that. It all boils down in 10 for that our determined purpose is that I may know him. That's what we need to concentrate on. I don't need to look at what I need to be and try to be that. I need to know Christ and let him make me what I need to be. It's not so much meant to be a religion, but it's a relationship with Jesus. And you hear that a lot. But the difference in that is religion gives you a set of rules, and if I accomplish these things, then I'm good. Christ says, look, I just want you to know me, and I'm going to give you some good things to do, but if you mess up on them, I'll forgive you. And I'm going to transform you through this situation to make you more like me, and you're going to mess up, and that's okay. We'll forgive you. I'll pick you back up. I'll heal you. We'll go back through it again, and I'll use that to teach some things to you through that. Because your whole life, you know, all of this is about knowing Jesus. That's the goal. It's not about a meeting. It's about linking with Jesus. Your whole life is the fulfillment of this purpose of knowing God. And for Paul, knowing Christ is the win. That's the win. And increasing in this relationship was the entire reason that Paul existed. In a real sense, more and more disciples gave Paul more and more opportunities to know Christ. It's one of the reasons we come to church. I can see what God's doing in your life, and you can see what God's doing in my life, and you can see I can see what God's doing in your life, and you can see what God's doing in their life, and you can see, okay, I see some things. My eyes are more open about what God can do. Guys, this is or maybe somebody goes through something and they mess up and they fall down, and you go, okay, that's why God was telling me not to do that. I will make a note not to do that. You don't ridicule them and run them out. Okay, well, hey, let me help you back up. This is why we shouldn't do that. And we're going to make a covenant together. We're going to hold each other accountable. We're not going to do that again because I don't want to fall and you don't want to fall again. See what I mean? That's kind of how that works. It's this in a real sense, when Paul was planning churches, he was getting more and more opportunities to know more and more about Christ. It was what God told him to do, but it was benefiting him as well. And I remember a man who attended Bay West years ago. I mean, he was in his 50s at the time, and I thought he was ancient. I'm an idiot. So, I remember, he said he was in his 50s, and he had never heard the gospel. He was familiar. I know that's crazy in America. Sometimes you think everybody's heard it. No, not everybody's heard it. He was familiar with the term Christian. He knew what a church was, but when we went in the military, he didn't even know enough to say what religion his was, so they just put down atheist. So I remember him telling me this story when we led him to Christ. He said, when the realization of the gospel hit him, this big rough guy just comes out in tears to his wife, and he goes, "Is this true? If so, I've wasted 50 years of my life." I want you to think about that. That's a tough thing to understand. Those of us who are on the back half, if you realize you just wasted the whole first half, dadgummit. Oh no, that's bad. It can be disheartening. That can be daunting. The truth is we can all feel like that no matter where we are in our journey. We're like those 20 minutes I wasted on social media conversation and resolution and, that were gone didn't seem like a whole lot of great immediate result. We got back to norm. And so there we were. We could have not had it and been the same people maybe. But now immediately you may be thinking of this. And, and when I tell it, so sometimes people think, that of all the time you've wasted in your life and all the times you've wasted, maybe not following Christ at all, or maybe after you were following Christ and you just blew off and didn't do. But see, the good thing is the purpose of our life is the journey to the truth of Christ. That's the whole point of what Paul was saying. See, so if you found the purpose, the journey is melding your life to that purpose. And we have things like this get out of jail free card I always love. And you've heard it before. We often come back to Romans 8:28, about how God works for the good of all those who love and serve the Lord and call him according to his purpose. And we know that. And a lot of times we look at that when we say, okay, something really bad is happening to me right now, and I trust that God's working for the good of those who love and serve the Lord, and so I'm going to trust him even though I don't see how good this is, and this is really terrible, and I'm just going to work through it and trust God through it, and this is going to happen, and we'll see that. Sometimes we'll see what that is, and we often come back to that. And we take solace in it. But there's so much more to it than that. Okay? I want you to get this. There's more to it. I want to, and let's just stay with the Amp C for a minute. And I want you to listen to, as I read Romans 8:28 in the Amplified Version. It says, "We are assured and know that God being a partner in their labor, all things work together and are fitting into a plan for good to and for those who love God and are called according to his design and purpose." Do you see that? That ultimate purpose is to know Christ. All of our lives are about that possibility. And when we know Christ, all of our lives, past and present and future become part of this glorious journey of knowing Christ that will be accomplished fully because God started his work, and as we said in Philippians 1:6, he's going to finish it. So what I want to tell you is all the hope and all the regret and the oh no that you had about the things that you wasted when you begin to follow Christ and you start knowing Christ, God now says, I'm going to take all of that, I'm going to make that valuable in knowing Christ. That's now, I'm fold that into your journey of how you got to be here with me. So you don't have to worry about that anymore. That's all part of this wonderful story that I have told through your life of how you came here and how you begin to know me. And we're going to move forward through that. It's not only are we forgiven and restored, but God is using that, making that part of this wonderful story of us becoming more and more like Christ. Your past isn't the shame. It's become valuable because God has redeemed the failures by making them part of accomplishing the ultimate purpose of knowing Christ. And that is in all of our lives.
All I once held dear, built my life upon all this world.